Well, here we are. I want to thank your Scoutmasters for inviting me over here and talking about something that's really quite important to both of the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts of America. With renewable energy on the forefront of everyone's mind nowadays and conserving our wildlife, which you guys and gals take wonderful advantage of, I would like to talk about one of our most underutilized forms of renewable energy. And if you have any questions during it, please raise your hand, call upon you, answer any questions that I can the best as possible. So, with the lovely environment warming up and our renewable resources becoming a more prominent factor in today's energy utilization, everyone knows about solar and wind and hydropower. Well, hydropower can create artificial lakes and destroy habitats of animals, but very little is known about nuclear energy, and it's very prominent when it comes to power over size ratios. So, if we look at the destructive capability of nuclear energy to the environment versus, let's say, solar power, the carbon footprint of a solar power plant is almost zero during its operation. There's some during its building, of course, but that is with any structure whatsoever. So we take that versus, let's say, solar panels, which actually produce more carbon emissions than coal to make when you do that in their lifetime put together. So first, let's talk about what an atom is. I'm sure you've all taken basic elementary science during your small elementary educations. So what an atom is, it is the smallest form of something. It's very tiny. For example, let's take this lovely jar of Red Hots candy, and then you take it, and each one of these little pieces of candy would be an atom in this jar, and let's say a molecule. So, much like these Red Hots, if we compare it to uranium, the main source of fuel for a nuclear reactor, the way it derives the energy in order to boil water and spin basically a fan is going to be breaking down these little molecules and atoms away from each other. That's called nuclear fission. Now, if you think about our sun, everyone thinks about it as a big ball of fire, right? Well, actually, it's just a really big nuclear reactor. It works on a slightly different principle, but it's still quite the same. So, if we take our little energy and we break it up, it's not a whole lot. There are a whole lot of Red Hots in the world, but this is just a small little package of it. So we think about that with nuclear fuel, and it's really quite nice. So, yes.
What's the difference between fusion and fission?
Well, fusion, or to fuse, so to combine, would be like how our nuclear reactors work. You take two atoms, or two of these little Red Hots, and you smash them together. And then basically what it would do is it would make all of the other Red Hots really, really mad, and then they fly away from one another. This, think like magnets when you're pulling them away from each other, actually releases a great amount of energy, a massive amount. That's actually where all the heat comes from in order to make a nuclear power plant. So, if we compare that to fission, which is how the sun works, the gravity is so hard on the sun that instead of just smashing them together and having them break apart, it actually smashes them together and they become one single atom. So it's like taking these two little Red Hots and smushing them together, kind of like what you can do with Skittles, and then you get multiple flavors. So that's a really good question. Thank you, Mary. So if we compare this to what we have nowadays with wind and solar, I mean, other than them being delicious treats, it's probably a good idea to switch to mostly nuclear energy. So if we take that, we remove a lot of the carbon footprints and destruction that happens with coal power, we can actually save a lot of the forests, and then we have lovely camping trips that you guys both go on. So, any other questions?
No, not right now, no.
Okay.
You've been very clear.
So,
I have a question.
yes.
Are there any problems with nuclear fission? Why people are so scared of it?
So, nuclear fission that operates in a power plant, though it does function on the same principles as some of the scary weapons that man has made, it uses different substances and is done at a much, much slower rate. So when you say nuclear energy, because it's associated with something, it's usually considered quite dangerous. Like, think about cars. Everyone knows about car accidents, and people don't blame the cars. It's more about what's done with it. So, if you take normal uranium out of the ground, a relatively dull rock that, no one really thinks twice about, and you do one thing with it, it can become something quite dangerous and should be controlled. Or if you do a different process on it, it can be turned into nuclear fuel and then used to power your homes. So much so, in fact, I don't know if any of your parents have an affinity for sports cars, but if you take 1 year's worth of little atoms left in a nuclear reactor, you'd have enough to make 2,000 sports cars that your parents drive. It is a lot. Or if we think about it, that's enough to power roughly 200,000 homes for about 5 years.
Ooh.
So, yes.
Question. How much of those material does it take to actually run a reactor?
Well, you have to get above what's called the fission mass. So it takes so much of the material to get it started. For uranium-236, which is actually what a nuclear reactor is powered off of, it's about 15 pounds. But once they're drawn into small rods and you get it started, it takes relatively small amounts of fuel. So much so that actually you can handle the cases of the rods when they're built and packaged with your bare hands. They're incredibly safe until they're actually put into the reactor and sparked by the reaction that's already occurring.
Then that's when it gets hot.
That's when it gets hot. It gets hot, it boils the water goes off into what is basically a giant fan. It spins it, kind of like how dams work, except it uses the steam and the heat produced by that reaction instead of just falling water. So when you look at the stereotypical like hourglass stacks from a nuclear reactor, it's not actually smoke, it's just steam coming off from cooling the reactor that's been used to power it. Most of the steam in all of our modern reactors actually never comes into physical contact with anything that's in the system that's actually radioactive.
And there are no radioactive particles in the steam?
There are not, because it's a dual isolated system in our new reactors. It's water heating water through an exchanger, so the pipes actually run close to one another, and kind of like your radiator in your parents' car, or like one of those old school radiators that people used to heat houses with, it's the radiant energy coming off one pipe to the other that actually heats the water that powers the generator. So after that happens, it goes back into the system, condenses, kind of like an AC unit, comes back into the reactor, gets chilled again, and then put back in the reactor to be warmed. So it's really quite self-sustaining and self-regulating. So, yes, Mary.
Are there any nuclear places here in America? Like, do we use this already?
There are 53 nuclear power plants in the United States. 3 of them in Michigan alone. One of them is actually relatively close to the Metro Detroit area, but nobody really knows that. They run really quite smoothly, and if you compare the dangers of other power sources to nuclear energy, there's only been 3 accidents. They're well known, but very few things have happened to it. So, with that, we can outweigh the pros and the cons, and really it comes down to a risk versus reward, and with the great amount of power, enough to power light bulbs forever with what we have. Yes, Lamont.
I saw a movie once where it was in Russia, where one of these accidents happened, and it was some 25 years later, and it was still contaminated. Is that true?
So, the incident you're talking about is the Chernobyl disaster. Most of the danger and fatalities that actually happened to that was not at the fault of the reactor. So, what happened was there was a faulty pipe, the secondary systems didn't kick in, and in order to save face or not telegraph that to political adversaries at the time in the CCCP, or what used to be Soviet Russia, there was a lot of red tape that had to be crossed. So they ended up stalling, and it did create an unsafe situation. But if you look at the correlation to the danger that actually happened and how bad it is nowadays, they're actually letting people resettle relatively close to Chernobyl itself. the contaminated zone is getting smaller and smaller. So with the modern things that happen now, it's working relatively well. Yes.
No. Well, like I said, but like if they, are they, if people move into this area, do they monitor their health for any radiation sicknesses or?
Absolutely. The government in question actually has tested the soils around the area to make sure that it's safe. And with the new way that they're using the new reactors, it decays much faster. So they're actually taking the contaminants from that area and using it to power other reactors as well. So there is some studies that have to be done, of course, with anything, but it's become a relatively safe zone, but it is slowly creeping back in, so they have to keep an eye on it.
Okay.
So I hope this was informative. Yet again, I appreciate you guys from sitting here and listening to me talk about the humble atom and everything that can be done with it.